I'm staying. Hello.
Welcome to the stage, U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, Alejandra Castillo, Qualcomm's Senior Vice President and Counsel of Government Affairs, Lori Self, and Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Kathy Vidal, in conversation with Allison Carlson about the rise of women innovators.
Great. Photo ops and selfies. Thank you all for staying with us. And what's the trick? Thank you, everyone. And we could not have been better set up for this conversation and some of the comments that Sandra was making about innovation. And you know, we've talked about the barriers, we've talked about not meeting our SDG goals. We know the gaps, we know the challenges about representation, but we also need to focus on the opportunity. And there is a tremendous opportunity, particularly with respect to innovation in the US and around the world and women's role in it. So not just having a seat at the table, but being agents of that change and how to really incorporate more women into the innovation ecosystem. And so I'm thrilled to have a few moments to be able to pick all of your brains. And also to those in the audience and those online, please feel free to submit questions. We want this to be interactive, and we'll field as many questions as we can from the room. But would love to start off with you, Undersecretary, and you know, when you're thinking about not just the challenges, but the opportunities in the innovation space, and specifically what you're working on. You know, we're talking about rights today as well, and intellectual property is certainly part and parcel of that. And so when you're thinking about your work and the work of the department, how are you thinking about this issue and how to harness the opportunities at hand?
What a great question. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. I have to tell this very quick story. So this week I was going through my email feed, and I saw this summit. And I thought, oh gosh, I've got such a busy week. I'd love to attend that. And then I scrolled down and saw that I was speaking. So I was so excited. I was so excited. So amazing conference. So thank you for having me here. I will say I have been focused on women for my entire career, trying to figure out how to lift women, working with women to support other women. And when I go from country to country, this is something that every country is focused on. Every country. Countries you may not think about when you think about women's rights or the role of women in society. Every country is focused on this because it is the biggest opportunity. And all the countries know that we need more jobs, we need more economic prosperity, we need to solve the SDGs. And the only way to get there is to pull in the people who have not traditionally been represented at a high enough level. So when I think about it, I think about the entire ecosystem. I think we've got to get to the girls first. So we do a lot of training in the schools from K through 8 on innovation, entrepreneurship, intellectual property. So they know what this is about. They know the opportunities that exist for them. I will say that as part of that, they also learn about creativity. And what I hear is the art draws them in, but by the end of the session, I'm talking to girls who say, I wanted to be a cheerleader, now I want to be an engineer. I mean, these are 9, 10-year-olds. It's incredible. And then beyond that, we need to work the entire ecosystem. So we teach in the schools, we teach the teachers to teach innovation, entrepreneurship, opportunities in the school, to teach it in the right way. It used to be that in our schools, the way we taught innovation was we said, how high can you shoot up that rocket? And can you protect that egg when it drops, right? I mean, how many people, that was what science was about. And now we're realizing that women, people of color, we want to solve for empathetic things that make a difference. And so as soon as we change that model, we bring way more people in. I could go on. I just want to mention two more things because I know we have a lot of questions. Two more things that we're doing. One is we realize that the way we communicate as US government with people is not friendly. So at the USPTO, the very first thing you receive when you apply for a US patent is a rejection letter. Not so friendly. And guess, do women persist at a higher rate than men or vice versa? It's vice versa. So what we did recently is we changed the communication. Now when you file for a patent or trademark, the very first thing you receive is a welcome letter that says, welcome to the USPTO. We're here to support you. Hear about our Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative. Hear about pro bono. Hear about if you want to go it alone, how we're here to help. Find out if you have other intellectual property. So that has been a huge focus of ours. And beyond that, I just want to give you one statistic that gives me a lot of hope. And I'm sure we'll get into other initiatives later. So right now, the percent of women on US patents is 12 to 13%. 12 to 13%. When we get out there with our pro bono, which I doubled down on the minute I got into office, we upped it to $1 million a year that we're spending, and with organizations that are also doubling down with us. So we're sharing the cost of this. With the work that we've done, the percent of women who benefit from our pro bono is 43%. So that just gives me hope. And if you look at the other demographics, I know we're here to talk about women, but it's 30 to 35% people who identify as Black or African American, 14% people who identify as Hispanic American. So I'm really hopeful that if we just get out there with resources, meet people where they are, we know everybody has good ideas. We know everybody has at least the same potential to participate. We just want to reach them where they are.
Very well put. Thank you. And so many issues that you raise that I'd love to dig into. First, going back to your first comment about the opportunity. And I really do think we have an opportunity here to frame it in that way and frame the challenges in this way. It is an opportunity. And so, Assistant Secretary, I'd like to turn to you when you think about that and the economic opportunity, not only for the country, but for women, for their families. You are in charge of a $5 billion fund that is really allocating resources to drive that kind of change and drive that economic impact. And so when you think about that intersectionality, what are your priorities and how are you thinking about that as you're allocating funds within the department?
So great question, but let me also contextualize it a bit. We're now gathering here in Washington, D.C. If you walk down the street a few blocks from here, you'll bump into the Department of Commerce. You can't miss it. It's massive. But the reason I also want to contextualize it in terms of where we are and the department as a whole is because I have the pleasure of working with Kathy, and we do some good trouble together, which is wonderful. The other thing I want to contextualize is the moment in time, right? We have a president who has really taken investing in America very seriously. 4 major pieces of legislation. If you haven't read them, if you haven't been tracking them, please do. It's the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure, bipartisan infrastructure law. It's the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the CHIPS and Science Act. 4 massive pieces of legislation that are anchoring around this concept of economic development, but also anchored around equity. And one of the things that we did at the Department of the Economic Development Administration, which is the bureau that I lead, is to look at our investment strategy, investment priorities. And we said, you know what? We need to really put equity at the top. That is an opportunity because what that does is, in addition to putting equity at the top of the priority list, it's also how we have designed these grants. For many reasons, government, for a long, long time, would always tell communities what they should do. Very prescriptive. We've flipped the script on that. What we have done is we are now asking communities, tell us what your assets are. Tell us what's on the horizon for you with regards to economic development. Tell us who you're bringing to the table. Tell us who's missing at the table. And put together your best proposals. So most recently, and I'm sure you're referring to this, just day before yesterday, we announced tech hubs. This is a way to democratize technology and innovation. And it's really fascinating because it's making, as Kathy may say, it's recognizing that technology and innovation just doesn't live along the coast. It's in places like, Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's in places like, Champaign-Urbana in Illinois. I bring that up because that is a $10 billion program. We only received 5% so far. But it is a way for our nation to look at technology innovation and also tap into the resources of particularly women, and that intersectionality of race and gender, looking at women of color as well. How do we show up with our best ideas? So there's a lot of excitement. I'll stop here because I know we're going to have some questions. But I do want to give you this as a challenge. Wherever there's a challenge, there's a solution. And right now, there are many ways to finding solutions of how we can actually approach inclusive economic development. If you haven't visited the EDA, please do so. And I always give out my email, so my email is simple, acastillo@eda.gov. Reach us. As Kathy said, we are trying to change how government works. And that is one of the ways that we can do so, by reaching out and communicating as best as possible.
And that's a very clear illustration of what you were describing about being welcoming. It's rare you have someone at your level of seniority passing out their email and saying, contact me, and being very sincere and earnest about that. And I think those are the kinds of changes that are absolutely needed to welcome everyone in this room and elsewhere, to that conversation. And so, Lori, I'd like to turn to you. And, when you're thinking about, and when Qualcomm is thinking about greater inclusion and the employment pipeline, what have been your and the company's priorities in that regard? Certainly a company that is at the forefront of technology and also making substantive and material changes as it relates to inclusion of women. So what have been your priorities, and what are you focused on now?
Yeah, so we are essentially the R&D engine for the mobile ecosystem. That was our mission with our founding. That ability to fulfill that mission was very much dependent on our ability to access the patent system as a means of incentivizing, justifying that R&D. And so we look at this issue around inclusivity in the patent system both as a corporate imperative. If we're going to maintain leadership in R&D and technology, particularly today, as we think about these issues through that geopolitical lens, we've got to be harnessing our very best engineers and talents. And what's really interesting when we look at these patterns of biases, unconscious biases often, but also systemic biases, what we saw in our own engineering workforce were incredibly talented, highly educated female engineers who did not view themselves as inventors. And that is a dynamic we see across the economy. Really doesn't matter what your education level is. If you're not taught to think of yourself as an inventor, as a potential owner of intellectual property rights, that in and of itself becomes a really powerful gating function. And part of that is valuing your inventions, your creative endeavors, thinking that they're worthy of intellectual property protection. So we saw internally a need to overcome these barriers through a variety of programs. But what we started out to do at the outset was simply to understand the scope and the dimensions of the problem. And then we have followed up by instituting a number of programs that have meant to help bridge these various gaps. Externally, though, we are deeply committed to a strong intellectual property system. It's fundamental to our success as a company, but we also want to replicate our success. The strength of the U.S. innovation ecosystem has been a patent system that, at its roots, was designed to be democratic. So you talked about democratic access to technology. What the Constitution envisioned was democratic access to intellectual property as a means of economic opportunity, as a means of harnessing inventive and creative talents. We know that vision has not been fulfilled for a variety of reasons. And so, one of our goals as a company has been, number one, to, again, understand the nature and scope of the problem. What we know through the research is that if we were to solve this problem, we would add about $1 trillion of economic growth to our economy. We would quadruple the number of inventors in our economy. And as we think about what a patent is, I mean, it's essentially a technological solution to a problem. And I think what's really important to understand is that as human beings, we perceive problems differently depending on whether you're a woman, a person of color, a member of an underrepresented community. And so as you think about growing that innovation pie, it's really about allowing people to solve problems that are important to them and their community, and to potentially commercialize those solutions through access to the patent system. So in addition to research, we've supported public policy. I think Department of Commerce and PTO have been just unbelievable partners in really leading this issue in the US and globally. We have we've created an alliance of kind of like-minded universities, associations, nonprofits, et cetera, who are really committed to building an diverse invention community called Invent Together. And then we have, through Invent Together, created tangible resources that are custom designed to target a diverse community. So one of the first things we've done is created a tool called the Inventors Patent Academy, which is a patent education tool. And part of what Director Vidal was discussing is that, the patent system, in addition to all the other barriers we see around gender diversity in our economy, there are unique barriers associated with the patent system because it is a highly technical, specialized area of law. And so it's not just enough to educate people about the patent system per se. You've got to educate them about what it means to be an inventor, why it matters, why patents matter, and then also to kind of show them through example that they can be inventors. So we worked with partners across the patent education, DEI community to create a tool that is designed to reach diverse inventors and to showcase examples of diverse inventors so they see themselves in other inventors. So it's a continuum of activities, but it's been incredible to see the level of support around this issue, including bipartisan support within Congress. And there aren't many issues today that can coalesce members of both parties across genders, across different types of demographic divides. So, and just to build on the technology hub development, which we're super excited about, one of our areas of focus now as we think about building our patent ecosystem is geographic diversity. So bringing those resources into different parts of the country that are not historically viewed as innovation hubs, and again, creating that kind of grassroots opportunity to become innovation hubs.
Absolutely, and also around the world.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Eager to hear kind of what's working, and I think you articulated the partnerships and the synergies really well, and that I think can be built upon. And so, Director Vidal, I'd like to turn to you. When you think about those kinds of partnerships and what's working in terms of reframing this and also welcoming women into a field, a sector where, as you very clearly put it, women aren't feeling like they belong or see themselves as inventors. How are you seeing that change, and what is moving the dial?
So I think it all starts with understanding where the issues are. So sometimes the issue is more of a barrier to whatever is to come. And that's Alejandra and I've worked on that a lot with the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship that Alejandra leads. So we're trying to figure out what are those barriers. For example, I mentioned the rejection. That was a barrier. There are other things that we found are barriers. And then figuring out what is it affirmatively that women need. So we did that as part of our Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative that Alejandra and I launched with the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. And in talking to women, there were 3 things that were really key to their success. One of them was intellectual property. It really is a democratizer. When you go in and talk to people about funding, when you talk to companies about what you're doing, if you have not protected your intellectual property and you don't have a history of success, it's extremely difficult to move forward. Number 2 was the concept of mentorship. That women do better when they work with each other and when they work with other people, when they collaborate versus compete. So trying to create that type of environment for everyone. And then number 3 really is the funding. And as Alejandra said, now is the time. Our US government under the Biden administration has invested $200 billion in our economy, with $600 billion coming from industry. So it's not only the time with US government leaning in heavily, including the Department of Commerce, but also industry leaning in heavily. So when I think about the future, I think about just trying to figure that out and then bringing women together, which is what we're doing with the Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative, which is what we're doing in the school system, which is what we're doing when we expanded recently the ability to practice before the USPTO, just lowering those barriers and bringing women together in an ecosystem where we're not asking them to first self-identify as an inventor. We're asking them about their ideas. We're asking them about what problems they want to solve. And we're coalescing around that and then giving them the support they need to make sure that they're going to be successful on their journey.
Harnessing the ideas, I love that. We do have a question from the audience, so I'd like to turn to my colleague, Claire.
Sorry, can y'all hear me? Well,
I can repeat it.
okay, I'll just project. Sorry. So Odette in Gihanga, Burundi is wondering what advice you have for women in rural areas about how to really realize and embrace their full potential.
We'll repeat that quickly for those who didn't hear. I didn't hear the person who asked, but is reaching us from Burundi, is that right? About what advice you would give to those in rural areas who may not have access to the opportunities elsewhere. And so I'd like to turn to you, Assistant Secretary.
That's a great question. I'm going to answer it a bit of, policy matters. And in the US, we have taken an approach from a policy perspective that, to what's been already mentioned, how geographical diversity matters. The work of EDA, unfortunately, is not in the international space, but what we've done here in the US is to recognize, as I said before, that innovation lives everywhere. And how do we actually figure out ways to incentivize those individuals in rural areas who have great ideas, who are looking at the world from a different lens, but just equally as important, finding those policies, those programs that can actually support them. Let me just give you an example of what we've done here in the US. Areas like Fresno, California, which is, if you've never visited Fresno, it is just an incredible place. And most of our food comes from California. And what they have done is that they've married agrotech. So they're looking at technologies that will help them with regards to irrigation, using drone technology. Now, clearly, and forgive me for this, I'm speaking only from a US perspective. The US government has now reached out to those individuals and those areas across the country to provide the support and the dollars. But as Kathy said, going back to the partnership, this is where not only it's a government role, but it's also the private sector. It's also philanthropy that has to play a role. And how do we bring all of these different types of capital to actually refocus them? Because not everything lives in urban areas. So it's really changing the paradigm and bringing in more diverse types of capital, encouraging those innovators that exist around the world. And if the pandemic taught us anything, is that we need those innovators, because we need innovators to help us pivot when the uncertainties of life impact us. When there's climate change, when there's a pandemic, when there are disruption in our supply chain, we need all of these different types of innovators to help us problem solve. So forgive me for not having a very linear answer to it, but I guess the message I want to leave you is it takes literally a village of both capital, incentivizing, and women supporting women, which we still have a long way to go on that one too.
Absolutely, and please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add internationally that, as I mentioned, all the countries I've interfaced with are focused on this. So if you live in another country, I would say get together with other women. We are stronger together. Once you get together with other women, go talk to your intellectual property office. No doubt they are trying to find out how to reach you. Go talk to your office that's in charge of commerce. Talk to your ambassadors. The ambassadors across the world, whether it's a US ambassador, if you're interested in also exporting product to the US, or whether it's your ambassador, talk to them, because we are very focused on this across the globe, and there are resources everywhere, and they could either connect you up with the resources, and if they don't have them, if you come with a group of women, you can strategize on how you can create those resources.
Thank you for that question. It's such an important one. And Lori, I'd like to turn to you as we close out our time. And as you think about that and opportunities around the world, particularly in areas that aren't necessarily in a tech hub that's been formally established or in a big city, what are ways that young inventors, entrepreneurs, and others can engage? And what are some of the projects that you've been working on to that end?
Well, so just to build on what's already been said, I think it's worth noting that the World Intellectual Property Organization, just to build on Director Vidal's point, has been incredibly focused on this issue. And so that has become kind of a network of resources and information and education in this space. In the countries where we are very active, let's use the example of India. We have created patent education programs. We've partnered with entrepreneurship programs to, again, really position those educational tools as a means of reaching that small inventor startup community. There's a lot of examples of those kinds of, again, sort of grassroots activities. But again, it really is a multifaceted dimension or issue with many, many dimensions. One of the issues, candidly, that's a huge barrier as we think about women and people of color and underrepresented groups accessing the patent system is the digital divide, which of course exists across the US, across the world. And so part of what Qualcomm has done from a philanthropic, we have a program called Wireless Reach, is enabling access to those basic communications technologies that create the tools for whether it's building entrepreneurship, creating additional means of economic opportunity, but that in and of itself becomes a kind of gateway to the patent system. And so, we have to really think about, just to build on what's been said, sort of creating an ecosystem of organizations, and that's what we've tried to do in the US through Invent Together, where it really is, it's universities, it's venture capital groups, it's groups that are focused on issues around diversity more broadly for women, corporations, but we've got to create networks in different countries that can help mobilize those resources, because there's no one thing. It's a multitude of things. But I think what we've seen, again, just to repeat what I've said, is there's such a strong commitment to make progress in this space. There's such a strong recognition globally of how important our innovation economy is. And I think there's a recognition that as human beings, we are all innately inventive and creative. And we can harness those sort of uniquely human traits to create opportunities for our communities, for ourselves, for our countries. So that's a message we try to communicate across the countries where we are active. But I think through organizations like WIPO, which is deeply supported by Commerce and USPTO, that has become a kind of ubiquitous message globally, which is really, I think, an incredible development. As I think about my career over the last 30 years in the IP space, it's really nice to see a point in time where there's just, a resounding consensus that this is a problem that needs to be solved and that we can solve it.
And I think a thread throughout all of your comments has been connectivity.
Yeah.
Whether it's digital infrastructure, whether it's the hubs in rural areas, whether it's changing the messaging and welcoming women and others into the innovation space. That is how that change is going to happen. And you're all contributing to incredible progress to that end. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for welcoming all of us into that space as well. Appreciate it.